So the next major innovation that we see in plants are seeds. So everything that we're going to talk about from here on out has vascular tissue, but now the next major trait that they've gained, seeds. Okay, why are seeds so important? What's the deal with seeds? Seeds are basically time capsules for plants. They allow plants to travel both through space, move away from their parent plant, and they allow their offspring to travel through time. Okay, so here are just some extreme examples of what I mean by this. You may have seen an image of this flower before. This is Selene cynophila, probably saying that right. It's a narrow-leaf campion. It's found in Siberia. And if you've seen the movie Ice Age, right, the squirrel buries its seeds and then is always losing them or something's happening. They actually found in the permafrost seeds of this plant from about 32,000 years ago that they think a squirrel had buried because it had little teeth marks on the seeds. So they found a squirrel stash from 32,000 years ago, and while the seeds themselves were not viable because the tissue on the outside the seed had been damaged, the embryo, the sporophyte embryo inside the seed was viable. So they separated that embryo from the seed, and then they grew this plant from a seed that was 32,000 years old. What? Ah! Or this Methuselah date palm right here, right? This is a date palm grown from seeds that are over 2,000 years old. They were doing an archaeological dig in Jerusalem. They found really, really old seeds, basically from dates that had been stored in a 2,000-year-old version of a pantry. And then they germinated those seeds. And now there's a date palm that's from a seed that's 2,000 years old. Okay. So seeds are a major, huge innovation. Massive. Like, seeds are really what allowed plants to take over the world. Okay. So what's in a seed? Why are they such a big deal? Seeds are the sporophyte embryo, that diploid sporophyte embryo, multicellular embryo, surrounded in a package of fat and proteins, protected in a nice protective coat. I'm saying protective a lot, but seeds are the next generation, packaged with food to get them started, and then protected. Okay? Different plants will kind of have different forms of their seeds, but the idea is embryo plus food. Big deal. Protect that, so that way that embryo can survive for a while, and then when conditions are right, it can start growing, start using that fat and those nutrients stored up, can start growing. That's huge. Okay, that is huge. So we are talking about, just kind of orient ourselves right here. We are talking about these two groups, Gymnosperms and Angiosperms. These are the seed plants, sometimes also called spermatophytes, because sperm means seed, phyte means plants. So these are sometimes called spermatophytes. We'll talk about Angiosperms in their other unique adaptations, because they have some other cool stuff going on in Angiosperms later, but both of these create seeds. Okay. Both of these are sporophyte dominant, just like the seedless vascular plants. And all of these have vascular tissue. Okay, but the major innovation here that we see in these two groups is seeds. All right, along with seeds, we get a new type of reproduction in this group. So ferns, mosses, their sperm still have to swim, right? Here, seed plants, they took a totally different route that is way more effective for reproduction on land. Their gametophytes are reduced and dependent upon the sporophyte. Now the gametophyte stage in these seed plants is contained in the reproductive structures. And the gametes that they make, so the gametophyte is contained in the reproductive structures. In Gymnosperms, that's going to be inside the cones. In Angiosperms, that's going to be inside the flowers. What I'm showing here is a male cone of a gymnosperm, of a conifer. And inside that male cone, so we have a micrograph of right here, there contains the gametophyte tissue. Okay, inside here is where the gametophyte tissue is. Those cells will go through meiosis to produce the gametes. Okay, so they still make gametes. They still have gametophyte stage. It's just now very, very, very small and totally dependent upon the sporophyte. And now the gametes are different. The gametes are going to be totally different than what we've seen in ferns and in the non-vascular plants. Their gametes, the pollen can now float through the air, and the eggs are going to be retained inside the female gametophyte, but now they're going to produce lots of fats and proteins to surround that embryo after fertilization. Okay, so the gametes of seed plants, the male gametes, we call it pollen. Okay, so pollen, we kind of touched on spore pollen in the last week. This is some pollen grains. These are haploid cells. These are the gametes, male gametes, surrounded by a protective coat to prevent desiccation. Okay, so these are angiosperm pollen. These are the pollen of flowering plants. This over here is the pollen of a gymnosperm. Okay, the key though is that they are small and they are light and they do not swim. So how does this pollen get from one plant to another? They float through the air in gymnosperms, or in angiosperms, they rely on animals. So gymnosperms take their pollen and they just spread it out on the wind, and they produce so much of it that eventually, like 1 in 300 million chance, that pollen's going to land on a female cone and find the egg. Okay, but we see they have some adaptations here that help them with being buoyant in the air. Okay, so this is what we call the generative cell. This is where the DNA is at, the pollen DNA. These two cells right here, these kind of like Mickey Mouse ears, those are just air sacs. They're just basically empty cells to provide like kind of like little balloons sitting on top of that pollen to help it float through the air. Okay. Angiosperms pollen is what we see over here. They have many different types of adaptations. Some of them are adapted to attach to bees, some of them attach to butterflies. Some of them also spread through the air as well, but angiosperms have their own weird way of doing things. Gymnosperms typically are going to spread their pollen through the air. Okay, so they're very buoyant and light. They're just going to produce a lot of it and spread it through the air. Okay, so male gamete. The female gamete is contained inside the ovule. Okay, so this is a new structure that we see in seed plants, this ovule. So here's an angiosperm ovule right here. The eggs are contained inside here. And then this is a gymnosperm ovule over here. Eggs, so this is basically a cross-section of a female cone, of like a normal pine cone. So the eggs are contained inside the base of the cone. Hang on a second. So like this right here, right? So this would be an ovulate cone. And so what we're seeing is a cross-section, and then the seeds, the ovules, are going to be at the base, kind of buried deep down into what we call the bracts of the cone. Okay. This is a mature cone because it's open. Typically, they're going to be closed. I'll share some cool videos of time-lapse of how these work. But you're going to have multiple eggs inside of so this entire structure is an ovary. The ovule inside the ovary is where we find the eggs. And so we're protecting that egg inside of this ovule. And now this tissue that's surrounding it can create nutritive source, food, fats, proteins that can sustain that embryo once it starts to germinate. Okay, same thing over here. This tissue can create food to surround that embryo, to put in the seed, so that way it can start itself off on its journey. So seeds are huge. Seeds make it way more likely that sporophyte embryo will be able to germinate and start off its journey. Okay, because it has food. It has some resources it can use to put down its roots, put up its shoots, before it has to start relying on its own photosynthesis products. Okay, so talk quickly just about gymnosperms. Some of the different types of species that we see in gymnosperms. The most common of these is conifers. You all kind of know what conifers look like, hopefully. They're the pine trees that are around here. They produce cones. Many different varieties of pine cones, right? So that's the most common member of gymnosperms. They're important to us because they make up most of the lumber that we use for building is coniferous lumber. Okay. But there's some other interesting members of this group, kind of that one weird uncle that you only see during the holidays. I don't know. So here's Welwitschia. This is also a gymnosperm. It lives in the deserts of South Africa. And it can live for hundreds of years. And that's basically as big as it gets. Its cones are right in here. Okay. So very, very interesting, really kind of unique gymnosperm. And here we have a cycad. Here's its male cone right here. These kind of look like palm trees, but they have more kind of stiffer leaves and they typically grow really slowly. They're also very expensive. And I haven't seen any since I've been here in Oregon, but they're more common in warmer areas like Arizona, Southern California, as they're not native to those areas, but they're common as landscaping plants there. Okay, so cycads, Welwitschia, and conifers are the most common members of gymnosperms. And again, gymno, naked, sperm, seed. And what that means, naked seed, is that it's not surrounded by a fruit, which is where we're going next. Angio means covered. Angiosperms are the covered seeds. They cover their seed in a fruit. Gymnosperms do not.